So I want to speak today about how to use abstraction in art as a tool in your tool belt. Obviously, we've been doing these paint talks, going over some of the more obvious things about how to start art, or rather, obvious is a bad word, some of the more introductory things, right? How to start creating every day. What should you create, right? How do you balance your ideas with your skill level? All these things, right? And I think abstraction at first might seem like kind of a leap from there, right? Like I think we deem abstraction to be something that is only to be done later on in your artistic journey or whatever. But I, looking back now, as somebody who's been doing this since I was way younger, not painting specifically, but just making stuff, it's something I wish that I realized was so much more simple than it is at a way earlier age. Like sometimes I think that not so much I'd be making better art if I learned it, but I think that I would just, I think I'd be a better artist, if that makes sense, right? I don't think I would be making better paintings than I am right now, but I think I would be a much better artist, much more experienced, with much more to say and better ways of saying it, right? I guess to put it more eloquently than that, I think I'd have better ideas than I do if I started practicing it when I first got into art, which is why I want to talk about it, right? How to use it, and largely, I think the idea here isn't so much a tutorial on how to use abstraction in art, because that's kind of impossible, right? That's the whole point of abstraction, is going to come out a different way for everyone, but more so how to let abstraction into your art as a natural thing that will happen, right? And that is the thing I wish I understood earlier, and I wish I would do when I was younger, right? When I was first starting to create. First of all, I think it's worthwhile here talking about why aren't people using abstraction art? Like, how come when people are learning to make art, they are rarely making a abstract painting? Like, how come they always start with the fundamentals and then abstraction is seen as something saved for the masters, right? I can't answer that question, right? I can come with a couple ideas though, and I think one of the main reasons is because abstraction's so hard to quantify, right? You can make a abstract painting and feel like it's something Picasso level, right? And there will be actually no quantifiable way to know that it's not Picasso level, ever. You can make an abstract painting at 5 and for the rest of your life be like, that is a masterpiece. And it's kind of hard to disprove why it's not a masterpiece, because it might as well be. By all metrics we have, there's no way of saying this is lesser, because there's none of that in abstraction. It's the most subjective field of art is abstraction, right? This is part of the reason why people don't like it, right? When you're starting to learn to make art, whether it's in an art class like it is for many of us when we were younger, or I know for me, it was just, on my own, you're doing it and it's easy to make a drawing, right? For me, I started drawing from Lego figures and comic books as a kid, right? So it was way easier to make a drawing of the Flash and go, that doesn't look like how it looks in that comic book over there, or draw my Lego figure and go, that's not how it looks in real life, and then make another one and go, this is closer to how it looks in real life than it is to maybe if I was, had a bone to make something a little more abstract as a kid. It's impossible from there to make that and adequately say, from an unbiased point of view, this adequately conveys this abstract emotion, right? That's almost an impossible feat to remove yourself from that and to say it, right? And this isn't to say that causes anybody from shying away from doing it, but I think that it causes away from people repeating abstraction when they're first learning art, right? Because, well, it's easier for me to go, this Lego Flash looks more like the picture than this Lego Flash. I've improved. Than it is for me to try and quantify the ostensibly unquantifiable with these abstract pictures here, right, that I've made as a kid. So for that reason, I think we don't look at abstract art. I think it's also almost impossible to teach. Like if you're a teacher in school and have to teach kids art, how do you even begin with abstraction? I wouldn't wish that task upon my worst enemy, quite frankly, because it's such a difficult thing to teach, right? Which is why I think that it ends up being a skill that is underrepresented, right? It's seen as, okay, Picasso could paint technically well. Now that he's transferring to this cubism stuff, it must be great because he's a master already. Whereas, let's say a kid picked up a pencil and started writing with cubism, that kid probably would have been treated like an idiot. In many cases, kids are treated like idiots for having styles that are not, don't look like Renaissance paintings right off the bat, right? I know, and I mean, comic books are a fairly permissible thing here in America, but I know for me as a kid, when I showed my art teachers my first drawings of comic book characters, they were like, this isn't art, you know. And like, you know, I'm not gonna do the like, oh, you know, woe is me. I'm actually glad that happened because it did cause me to branch out and explore other things other than comic books. But the point is that what's permissible to create when you're first learning is seen as a very small window, right? Which is why abstraction is not a adequate thing to create right off the bat. It's not seen as such, rather, right? But I think before we get into how to allow abstraction into your art, I think we should cover, like, what is abstraction? Why does it take place? Like, did a bunch of guys one day just be like, you know what? It's way cooler to do the face like this than like this. Not really, right? Abstraction does come from somewhere very real, right? Its roots really start when the camera comes, because painting, for a long, long time, was a practice of painting a person, usually a rich person, and going, look, you have a beautiful painting. That's why, like, for hundreds of years, painting was exactly realistic, right? And then the camera came along, and they were like, all right, this you know, the photo camera can do exactly what we can do in seconds. Kind of useless to paint the person as they are right here. I'll paint them as I feel them, right? And that was abstract. That's the root of it all, right? From there, it branches out into everything. You can trace that all the way up to where we are today with our contemporary art scenes, right? So that is the beginning of it. But what is that in reality, right? I think that obviously this is kind of a philosophical question, right? I think that it's totally cool that a lot of us are probably gonna have our own answers of what abstraction is in reality past this practice of just painting something not as it is in person, right? But I do believe that it's actually cutting out steps in the process, right? The way communication works in art is through a process of abstraction already, right? Let's take a song, for example. Good Luck Babe by Chappell Roan. Great song. Fantastic song. And best song ever, right? Loved it. Listened to it so much last year, and I still listen to it to this day. Amazing. I don't know why I'm going on for so long about how great this song is. I will like feel the emotions of that song when I'm listening to it. I, of course, have never had the experience of being a lesbian person who is trying to get another person to realize their own sexuality and have a relationship past friends. I've never had that experience. Obviously, if you can't tell, I'm not a lesbian. So that has never once happened in my life. However, I still feel the emotions from the song, and I can say for a fact that so many of my straight friends also feel the emotions from that song. How is that, right? And this isn't, I think a lot of people see something like that and they're like, oh, like you'll see the moniker of like Chappell Roan makes music for straight people then, right? And I think that is a misnomer there. I think what's actually happening is just how all art works, right? How are we able to relate to art from people from totally different backgrounds? Kendrick Lamar, for an example. He grew up in Compton, California, and had a childhood vastly different from mine, right? I still feel many of the emotions, and many of my, upper middle class white friends feel those emotions too when they listen to the songs. Is that because he makes music for that group? No, it's because you are relating not to the exact thing itself, but to the abstract message of said thing. You are, I'm not relating to this idea of somebody in a club who I'm like, why aren't you accepting that you are, of this identity, and why won't you have a romance with me? I'm understanding the abstract emotion of seeing somebody you care about deny themselves of a thing they want to do, right? That is, obviously not the most abstract emotion, for sure. I think that's a fairly grounded idea, and that is what you're actually feeling when you relate to something like that, right? So all understanding of art is abstract. Taking this example and placing it then onto a painting, when you feel the emotion of looking at one of these paintings from pre-camera times, right? You're looking at some aristocrat's daughter and you feel the emotion of love or something, you are kind of encoding this message that you perceive in front of you into an abstract form and then feeling that emotion that comes off of that form, right? Forms in art are always an ends to a feeling, or not always actually, you can never make always statements in art, but they are oftentimes an ends to a feeling, not so much just a ends in themselves as aesthetics, right? So that's what abstraction is. So I perceive, in my own personal opinion, of course there are multiple takes on this, I'm not, the authority on abstraction, but I perceive abstraction in its original form at the very least, to be sort of cutting out the middleman. Instead of going like, okay, you are going to see this image of a beautiful tree or a beautiful home, and you are going to feel an emotion of, feeling the beauty or feeling the presence of this thing. You are going to try and paint it in a way that communicates pure presence and nothing else, right? So through that, you're cutting out the middleman, you're cutting out the need for these aesthetics, and you're trying to paint an emotion. This, I think, is actually part of the reason why so much abstract art is extremely hit or miss for people. You'll see that people are more passionate about abstract art than maybe any other form of it, because sometimes it just doesn't work for people, right? Sometimes, since you are trying to paint something that is so uniquely personal, sometimes it will not click with people, or sometimes people are not ready to take their own, the logical side of their brain out of the equation enough to just feel a painting in front of them. And because of that reason, that's why I theorize personally that many people I know even hate abstract art, really hate abstract art, right? So none of this goes to answer our main question here. How do you get started with abstraction? How do you get started making abstract art? Well, I'm going to get to that in a second. One last thing I want to discuss here before we get into that. Why is there a need for this? Like, I think it's kind of an interesting question to ask, right? Of like, how come you can't just feel something in its most direct form? Why do you need a level of abstraction for these things to work? Well, obviously there's a lot of answers to that too. So many of the questions that permeate discussion around abstraction and communication are questions that we can't answer with science or anything. These are opinions at the end of the day, right? Is what I'm trying to say. I believe that the reason that this happens is because your thoughts are not linear, they're not 2D, right? Have you ever heard the phrase, it's a very famous, I don't know if it's a famous saying, but I've heard many people say it, language is an imperfect vessel for the emotions and the thoughts that we all feel, right? Maybe you've heard this before. It's a pretty, I feel like people say it more on the internet than anything, right? So this is something you'll commonly hear people say, and what they're trying to say, right, is that the emotions you feel every day, the thoughts you have, cannot 100% ever be communicated with language, right? Have you ever been sitting with somebody and trying to explain how you feel about something, and you're stuttering over your words, and nothing's quite coming out right, and you're like, that's not exactly what I mean, but you kind of get it, right? That is what so much of communication is, not because people are inadequate communicators, but just because there are not words for what we feel sometimes. Like, your emotions are more complex than anything can be, right? Language for sure, but art too. Sometimes art cannot adequately display the right emotion. There might not be the right color of blue that actually exists in painting yet for you to display the emotion you feel when you look at a person, right? So what does that mean? That means that because of this, we need to let thoughts be more abstract, right? When you think of something in your head, maybe it's an emotion, maybe it's a genuine point you have, that emotion, that feeling kind of comes to you in this wibbly wobbly cloud, let's say, right? It's this, all these things tangled up together, and to make sense of it, it feels impossible, right? Maybe you can use language, maybe you can journal, you can get that emotion out a little more, but nonetheless, you will always be sitting with a thought in your head that is more complex than any language could ever give the mirage of telling, right? So because of that, we need a way of telling that cloud, right? This is what poetry does so well. It can take language and it can organize it in ways that is more complicated, or rather simpler, but has more interpretive value than the average sentence, right? So you can look at poetry and you can be like, oh, I can feel the words in this poem because there are less of them, I can fill them with my own emotions. And that's why that works so well, right? Because you think abstract thoughts. Like, there is not a person out there who thinks and sees things in a perfectly linear form, right? This is why abstraction must exist. Why am I saying all this? This is a huge ramble. This is insane, right? One day, if you are being honest in your art, if you keep going in the most honest trajectory possible and creating every day, as we've discussed in the last couple episodes of Paint Talk, you will want to communicate something more complicated than anyone can understand. You'll try and communicate the emotion to your friend. You'll try and be like, I want to make this, and they'll go, I don't get it. Maybe you'll tell, your art teacher, if you're still have an art teacher, and they'll be like, yeah, whatever, right? That's because your thoughts are more abstract than language can describe. And I would be willing to bet at that stage, your thoughts are probably more abstract then the paints on the canvas painting the tree that you see in front of you can truly make you feel, right? So what do you do then? Well, I think this emotion needs to come natural. I don't think this is something that can be forced. But I think what needs to happen is when you're sitting at the canvas, when you're trying to create your next thing, after you feel this emotion, after you feel this sense of there is something larger than what you can communicate through the tools you have at your disposal technically, right? You need to put it into that art in whatever form it may come to you. Sometimes that decision won't make sense to anybody. Actually, most of the time that decision will make no sense to anybody. That's because you've made something genuine. You've made something that you feel. Learning how to take something and put it into a painting or a song or a book in the way that exactly it comes to you in your head without trying to make it into a linear form, without trying to put any fluff around it to make it look nice. When you put a pure, honest, raw thought into something, that is abstraction. People won't understand it, but you've just done it. So how do you put abstraction to art? To kind of put a end on this conversation here. How do you go about putting abstraction into your art? One, you don't. You don't try to make anything abstract until you feel that emotion come to you in an abstract form. And then you let it go in. You just don't fight it, is the thing. When you have that emotion that makes sense to nobody, you don't try to make that emotion make sense. You just tell it how you feel it, and that is abstraction. Sorry, I had to lock in on that shadow. I really messed up this little guy down here because he's so small, and I kind of was mad about that, so I really wanted to make sure I got that shadow right. This painting's not bad. I don't mind this. This is pretty cool. Yeah, so it's a guy looking up at 3 floating cubes. Or no, a cube, a triangle, or a cube, a pyramid, and a sphere. So yeah, go check this painting out. It'll be on the TikTok and the Instagram later this week. And until next time, guys, gals, and pals, my name is Max Dice. This has been Paint and Talk episode 245. I'm here every morning, painting and talking with you all.